Hey guys, I'm Dave and welcome to the Trull Gallery. Today, we're going to make a hat rack. I'm not one of those guys who wears a hat all the time, but usually what happens is I get somewhere and it's like, oh, I wish I had my hat. The problem is they either are stashed in the closet somewhere or hiding here behind my desk. And while this is close to the front door, it's still far enough away that I'll forget to grab a hat on my way out. So why don't we design and build a hat rack that'll go right by the front door so that on our way out, we can grab a hat if we want to. And with that said, let's see if we can pull off an interesting design that has just been rolling around in my head for a few weeks. Like most of my projects, this one started in SketchUp. I played around until I got the general design I thought would work. For some reason, I can't print full-size drawings from here. Maybe it's because I'm cheap and use the free version, or maybe I don't know all the tricks of SketchUp yet. Since I like to see my drawings full size, and this is relatively small, I recreated the CAD sketch on a piece of half-inch plywood. When the drawing looked good in real life, I could cut this out and use it as a template for the project. I trimmed the plywood sketch at the table saw. This gave me a square edge for mounting, or the right side, and a flat surface on the top of the swoop. I took the pattern over to my bandsaw and cut just outside my lines. I kept my cut close enough so that the cleanup of the next step would be easier. Just take your time and work through all those curves. To clean up the saw marks from the bandsaw, I chucked up a sanding drum in my drill press. I added my auxiliary table that allows the drum to sit below the work surface. This lets me keep the edge square to the face of my work. A light touch and a few passes on the drum cleans everything up in just a few minutes. The plan is to create my own plywood for the arm of the hat rack. To do that, I need to resaw my stock to about 3/16 of an inch. I had some leftover stock that I'd glued up and began to rip down the pieces I'd need. Yes, a bandsaw would create less waste, but my bandsaw doesn't want to cooperate in any rip cuts. So I made multiple passes on the table saw. First on one edge, and then the opposite edge. Then I'd raise the blade and repeat. This stock is almost 5 inches wide, so I took my time and cut my stock at about 5 passes per side. The freshly cut face was planed smooth before making the next cut. Then it was resaw, plane, and repeat until I had enough stock for the arms. Since each of my thin strips has one clean face, I only had to clean up the saw marks from the other face. And in the process, I also planed them down to the approximate thickness I was shooting for. By my math, 5 strips at 0.15 inches would give me 3/4 inch arms after glue up. The exact thickness isn't critical, and we'll just see what we end up with. We have a couple of large brimmed hats, so 2 arms are a bit longer than the others. At the miter saw, I cross-cut the stock for the long pieces, 3 in maple and 3 in walnut. Oh, didn't I mention that? I reset my stop and cut the pieces for the 4 short arms. So why am I going to the trouble to create my own plywood? Well, I'm keeping the arms as light as possible, and if I just made it from solid wood, there might be a chance of parts breaking along short stretches of long grain. To counter this, I'm alternating the grain on my laminations, and the species too. By alternating the grain 90 degrees on the internal pieces, we'll gain a lot of strength. To minimize things slipping around during the glue-up, I took the time to glue up the cross-grain stock. A bit of blue tape to pull the joint together, a bead of glue in the joint, flip it over, wipe off the excess glue, and add a second strip of tape to assist in pulling the strips together. After stacking 2 sets of arm stock together, I clamped them to help keep things in plane. Let's just hope I haven't glued 2 panels together yet. Once all the innards were glued up, I set them aside to dry overnight. The next day, I started by cleaning off any excess glue in those joints. A single-edged razor blade worked well, but so did my card scraper. Flexing the card scraper was tough on my damaged thumb, so I ended up using the razor blade for most of the cleanup. With that done, I could glue up my stacks of stock. I applied glue to one face, spread it out to ensure a good bond, and then added the next piece with the grain 90 degrees to the first. I repeated the stock until each stack had 5 layers of alternating materials and grain direction. I used a bit of blue tape on each corner to minimize the part slipping around when I added the clamps. Before that, I wrapped the 2 stacks in stretch wrap. This will prevent the excess glue from making a mess or gluing everything into one chunk. Now I could sandwich the stacks between 2 pieces of 3/4 inch plywood to help distribute the pressure. A clamp on each corner, and the stack was set aside to dry. I picked up a new toy and thought this would be a good time to try it out. I prepared 2 more stacks like before, only this time instead of clamps, I'm using a vacuum bag. I started by placing the stacks in the netting. That helps the air move through the bag when the vacuum is applied. Then I slid everything into the bag until it was centered under the valve. This bag is sealed with tape that's similar to weather stripping, only thinner. With the bag sealed, I could pump out the air. I wasn't sure it was working, and then the bag just began to conform to the stacks. Once I had completely evacuated the air, I set that aside overnight. I checked it periodically to make sure it was holding a vacuum, just in case. While the glue was drying, I moved on to work on the hat pedestals. The first thing to do was clean up the 6-inch circle I'd used as a pattern. I used some double-stick tape to hold it to my work table, then set up my circle cutting jig. I set my pin so that it was 3 inches from the near side of the router bit and locked it in place. I set my router for a light cut, plunged into my stock, and made the first pass. I adjusted the bit depth and repeated the process a few more times. I left about a 1/16 inch of stock on the disc, mostly because I didn't want to cut into my table. Switching to my router table on a pattern bit, I trimmed off that last little bit of stock. Going back to the bandsaw, I could cut out the 6 pedestal blanks I'd need for the rack. I had some 5/4 maple and walnut that would work well here. I just took my time and cut as close to my line as possible. A bit more double-stick tape was used to hold the pattern to the blanks. Then I could transfer the center point from the pattern to the blank. It is an 1/8 inch bit and just drilled in deep enough to be a starting point for the drill bit later. I don't have a patent bit long enough to clean these in one pass, so I started with this guy. This is why I kept my bandsaw blade close to the line. At this point, I want to remove as little material as possible. The challenge with routing a circle is that the grain changes directions at least 4 times. Light cuts here minimize the chance for tear out, and don't be afraid to make a few extra revolutions to make sure that you're left with a nice clean edge. I switched over to a slightly longer bit to complete the cleanup. The bearing rides on the edge we just cut, and the bit leaves one smooth face. Well, mostly smooth. Of the 6 pedestals, only one had some tear out. It's not too bad, and maybe once the sanding and final shaping are done, it won't be noticeable. My sanding drum did a great job cleaning up the router marks. Again, I made several light passes and kept things moving. I did a bit more work with my random orbit sander before moving on to the next step. With the edges sanded, I could add the roundover. I started with a 1/4 inch roundover bit in my router table and set the height for a partial cut. I ran both faces of all 6 pedestals, and then adjusted the bit height for a second pass. Just high enough to get the full roundover, but not so deep as to leave a line on the face. I switched over to a 3/8 roundover. I would have preferred a 1/2 inch bit, but I think it died and I never replaced it. Only the top of the pedestals got this shape, and while I probably could have done this in one pass, I still took 2 light passes to get the full profile. With a 3/8 inch brad point bit on my drill press, I set my depth of cut to go most of the way through these pieces. This will be for a dowel that connects the 2 parts of the hat rack later. The center point of the bit just fit that pre-drilled hole, making alignment a breeze. The next day I was grateful to find that my vacuum bag held all night. I need a bit more practice releasing the vacuum, but opening the seal worked. Once I got into the bag, I could tell pretty quickly that the stacks glued up just as well as the clamp ones. Not bad for a first test run. There was a bit of misalignment and glue squeeze out. To square up the first edge, I used my straight edge jig at the table saw. I removed just enough stock to give me a clean edge. Then I ran each piece again, this time giving me 2 parallel edges. I almost skipped this step because of the curved shape of the arm, but I realized I'd need those square edges in a few minutes. I need one end to be square to the edges, and those were trimmed at the miter saw. I also made sure to orient the stacks just right, because a few of them had defects and I needed to make sure they'd end up in the cutoffs later. I set the square end against my table saw fence, lined up the pattern so it was against the fence and the top was flush to the top of the stock, and then I could trace the shape on each blank. I transferred the location of the top to the edge of the stock, and then found the center of those lines. This would be where that dowel will connect the 2 parts together. And this is why I needed those 2 parallel edges. I set up my drill press with that same 3/8 inch brad point bit and set the fence and stop to drill the hole. I set my depth to 3/4 of an inch just to make sure I wouldn't drill through the curve in the arm. Then I could head back to the bandsaw and cut the shapes out. Again, I did my best to stay close to my line to make cleanup easier. The arms are a bit thinner than the pedestals, so I can clean those cuts up in one pass with that taller pattern bit. The pattern is attached to the blank with double stick tape, and then I can start my cut. By the 4th piece, I figured out a slightly less scary method. I started on the flat end and worked the stock around. In most cases, I took light passes and then went back for a cleanup pass, rather than force the cut all at once. Push paddles, like for a jointer, would have been good here, but they went when I sold my jointer back in the day. I made light, short passes, keeping my fingers out of harm's way, and stayed focused until that last piece was complete. With everything shaped and routed, it was time for sanding. I sanded everything from 120 grit through 320 grit. And with all those curves, there was a lot of hand sanding. With the finish I plan on using, I usually sand through 600 grit, but my bad arm and jacked up thumb couldn't take any more sanding. The only dowels I had on hand were 2 inches long, so I took them to the bandsaw and cut them to 1.25 inches long. The tape on the table is a guide for my cuts. As long as I'm close, everything should be fine. I took a few minutes to ease the freshly cut edges on the drill press. The dowel went in the chuck, and I used some 120 grit paper to knock off that sharp edge. I used those dowels to connect the arms to the pedestals. A bit of glue on the dowel and it was tapped into the pedestal. A little more glue and the arm was twisted in place. I tried to use enough glue to secure the dowel, but not so much as to create squeeze out. I was mostly successful. The final adjustment was to line up the grain on the pedestal so that it was in line with the arm. No one but me will ever notice that, but it's the little things that make me happy. To figure out the spacing of my rack assemblies, I started by setting one in a parallel clamp. Then I could move the other rack until it felt like there was enough space to take a hat off, but not crowd anything. I ended up with 5 inches between the top of one and the bottom of the next. From here, I could calculate the length of the back pieces. To make things as challenging as possible, I decided to keep the two-tone look in the back panels as well. The center strip is the same size as the arms, and the overall width is the same size as the pedestals, or 6 inches. I also made sure to keep the grain orientation of the outer boards. It's a small detail, but it should look cool once the finish goes on. A little glue, a few clamps, and the pieces were joined together. I also used a couple of cawls and C-clamps on the ends to keep the pieces in line. The two backs were set aside to dry overnight. I pulled the panels out of the clamps and cleaned them up with a few light passes through the planer. The final thickness wasn't critical, I just wanted the faces smooth. I determined the location for the fasteners on the back of one panel, clamped the second panel to the first, and transferred those locations. I also made sure that the center points of the top and bottom arches were lined up as well. Then I could use my compass to draw the opposite arc. I set up my drill press with a taper and countersink bit, and set my fence for the center line of the panel. I also set my depth stop so I get a consistent depth for the countersink. Then I pre-drilled the mounting holes for the arms on both panels. This seems like a good time to add a pair of keyhole slots to hang the racks. I updated my keyhole jig to help with this. I'll add a link to the video on how I made that, well, once I post that video. To use the jig, I lined up the top of the jig with a line on my stock, and aligned the center line of the jig with the center line of the stock. Then I clamped the jig in place, plunged the bit into the stock, and slide the palm router up and back. I don't remove the router until the bit is fully stopped. That leaves me with a hanging point that I can work with. I cut a second slot 16 inches from the first. The distance isn't critical, it just gives me a known distance for when I install the hanging screws in my wall later. I also made sure the keyholes would not interfere with the arm mounting screws. One last trip to the bandsaw to cut the curved ends of the back panels. Again, I cut close to the line to make cleanup easier. I'm too close to the finish line to risk any more tear out, so I decided to clean up the panels at the drill press. I used double stick tape to connect the two backs and sanded to my line. This kept the two pieces identical. Well, in shape anyways. A little more sanding, this time with my random orbit sander. I cleaned up the long edges at my work table with some 120 grit paper. For the curved ends, I moved to my shop stool for a better angle on the ends. Once everything was sanded through 320 grit, it was time to prepare for assembly. To start that, I marked the location of the upper hole on each arm. I marked the location with a punch, and then pre-drilled it with my taper bit. I used some number 8 by 1.5" screws to connect the arm assembly to the backs. I started by driving the screws through the back so it was just proud of the face. Then I set the arm in place with the screw in the hole that I had just drilled. Then I drove in the screw most of the way. Not fully tight, since I'll need to line up the arms on the center strip of the back. With the arm in the correct orientation, I drilled the second hole through the back. Then I could drive in that second screw. If everything looked good, both screws were tightened down. A few screws were slightly off, throwing out the alignment. I used a larger bit in my drill and opened the hole in the back just enough to give me some adjustment room. Then I could drive the screws in, again aligning the arms with that center strip. I didn't bother with glue, mostly because I didn't want to risk any more squeeze out. That and the two screws are plenty strong enough. With the assembly complete, the two racks were cleaned off and it was time for finish. My go-to finish for things like this is Danish oil. It's easy to apply, repair, and it's forgiving in a dusty environment. Oh, and it just begs to be touched. I wiped on a coat of oil once a day for 6 days. An acid brush is great for getting into those tight areas. Then I let the oil soak in for about 20 minutes before wiping off any excess. And with that, these racks are ready to install. This hat rack was a fun build, with a few challenges along the way. There are enough details and curves and shapes in here to make it interesting, even if there are no hats on it. The shop-made plywood and the mix of maple and walnut look really cool, and now my only excuse for not grabbing a hat on the way out is forgetfulness. Love to hear your thoughts on this video. Was there something I could have done differently? Smarter? Faster? Better? Drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear. As usual, I've listed some tools and materials that I've used in this project down in the description,
and some of them have affiliate links. And if you happen to purchase one of those, it does help keep the channel going. If you enjoyed this video, maybe give us a thumbs up and share it with friends. And if you haven't already, maybe hit that subscribe button and the little bell so you get notified each time I put out a new video. Not real sure what's coming up next, but I think it'll be interesting. So until then, have a great day, stay safe, we'll see you soon. Bye.